Gives me great pleasure to introduce our final keynote speaker for this conference, Professor Charles Taliaferro. He is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at St. Olaf College in the United States.
I've enjoyed so many papers, and in the interest of time, I'm going to now paraphrase my paper as giving enough details so that there'll be something that everybody will be unhappy with, so that there'll be some objections, but I don't want to there will not be time for me to read it straight through. Well, you started the conference with Rob's great paper on Aristotle, but I'm going to take you back here at the end to Plato. And I'm going to begin with a version of the argument from reason from Plato. Now, you can find what's known as an argument from reason all the way back to 340 BCE with Plato. You can also find it in Augustine and Anselm, moving way ahead, and it's been discussed in this conference to some degree, C.S. Lewis, Alvin Plantinga, and the like. And the argument in general has come to stand for an objection to the form of materialism or naturalism. Actually, it matches very well the version of naturalism that Peter Van Wagen, I'll just refer to him as Peter, to Peter's depiction of naturalism that was given earlier this afternoon. So there'll be three sections of the paper. One, I'm going to paraphrase Plato's use of an argument from reason. I'll then add to it a couple of twists to offer you. Actually, I'll be describing the view that I hold. I am not just a Christian philosopher, but I'm a Christian Platonist, more or less a Cambridge Platonist back to the 1600s. That's the school of philosophy that I've found myself after all these years. So it's a version I accept. Then I will ask the question, is it relevant today? To which I'll answer yes. Then the third section will be, and we'll keep this till quarter of the hour, so there'll be a half-hour discussion. I'll go through three objections, one from Elizabeth Anscombe, and this would be my moderator's specialty in the sense that she was a Wittgensteinian. She became increasingly so over the years. And I will look at Graham Oppy's objection, and then ever so briefly and unsatisfactorily, I will reply to Peter, who raised an objection to a version of the argument from reason advanced by William Hasker. Well, there are lots of dimensions of the Phaeda. There would be wonderful to spend time on, but I'm not going to. But I will mention just one leading up to the argument, which is his urging us not to fall into misology, which is a term for the hatred of argument and the hatred of reason. It's actually, I believe the dialogue, it was one of my favorites, I admit, but it's very impassioned for its not only appeal to reason, but appeal to us to actually engage in reasoning. So I find that it's very commanding. It's narrated by somebody else. The narrator tells us that Socrates, and of course we're talking about Plato's Socrates, was reading a book by Anaxagoras, and he found himself almost, enthralled by the work because of Anaxagoras' appeal to mind and intelligence. There's a passage which suggests that Plato is almost working against a background of a kind of massive teleological cosmic scene. That is, what he surmises at first or suspects is that this explanation of intelligence will in turn help him to understand the natural world. And because Plato following Socrates, and Aristotle believed something like this too, a guise of the good, that we perceive what we believe to be good and intentional. He believes he's found the key to understanding not just himself, but the world, but certainly himself. He then reads on, I'm not going to go through the passage, and what he is shocked by is that Anaxagoras ceases to speak in terms of doing things for reasons, but rather due to trying to give the cause of what is happening in terms of joints, bones, sinews. We would substitute, to use an old phrase early in philosophy of mind, C fibers firing. We would give some complicated neurological explanation, or perhaps more holistically taking account the central state nervous system and so on. But the key is that the explanation comes without any appeal to reason, desires, experience. Socrates rejects this. He rejects this because it's unable, it may serve, to use our terms, a necessary explanation for why he is sitting shackled in prison, but it doesn't give a sufficient explanation. The real explanation for him being there is that he's been found condemned by the Athenian state as guilty of corrupting children and impiety. I was at a conference at Harvard, I was on the meaning of life, and there was a eliminative materialist there who just believed reasons and desires had nothing to do with explaining what reality, I think what Peter refers to as the ontology room, what you would really say there is. And he said it's absurd on its face because someone needs to explain. He was from New Zealand. How did these molecules get from New Zealand to Cambridge, Massachusetts? So you have to have notions like there was a conference. People had beliefs and desires. What do we make of this as an assertion? It's not a discursive argument exactly from really fundamental principles. It is what may be honoring the Polish philosophical theologian John Paul II. It's a phenomenological argument of sorts, or it's an appeal to the evident, I would say, from my point of view, overwhelming reality. We can soften that to say the prima facie evidence of experience that we do indeed act on the basis of reasons and desires. Now, I'm going to add two more wrinkles to this. One is for the advantage of responding to Peter totally inadequately, I admit, but I'm going to anyway. And also in a response to Anscombe, I'm going to add two parts derived from the Phaedo very loosely. The first is that Socrates, Plato advance a substantial understanding of the self. Now, he does this, in other words, the self, to use your terms, is, I won't say organism, but as a substantial individual existing over time. And he does this in response to the suggestion that almost anticipates Aristotle that why not see the relationship of the soul and the body to music and a lute. And so when the lute stops playing, the music stops. Perhaps we are, I'm very self-conscious with Peter here about using terms like state or mode, but he offers reasons to believe that he's not a mode of his body. He does this partly when it comes to thinking about death. When he dies, his animal body is still going to be there. But he will not. He, the individual, will not. Now, my other, probably cheating philosophically a little bit, part is to grab onto my own version of a theory of forms to further fill out this picture of mental, intentional, causal activity. And that is the concept of state of affairs. We actually had an earlier section where people were worried about the difference between a proposition and a state of affairs. I actually I'm happy using the term propositions, but when I'm in the ontology room, I actually prefer just to go with states of affairs for really Pickwickian reasons. But states of affairs, briefly, aware that I have just 20 minutes to go, are abstract objects that can be said to obtain or not obtain. You could say occur or not occur. It's the equivalent of when we talk of properties being exemplified or not exemplified. The state of affairs, there being philosophers, obtains. There being unicorns, sorry for the tired example, unfortunately doesn't obtain. So back to that in a brief reply to Peter. All right, so we have an appeal to appearances. In actually a previous paper, someone was quoting Hegel as saying we should guard against common sense at all costs. And actually Kant said something familiar to that. I, on the other hand, am in the common sense philosophical tradition of, I actually think Plato and Aristotle were in this tradition. Aristotle often begins, what do the many and the wise say? And he is concerned about appearances. And so in my lineage in doing philosophy, I'm kind of with Thomas Reid, G.E. Moore, Roderick Chisholm, also Thomas Nagel in his most recent book, thinking that we should, beginning a key tool in our philosophy is what seems natural for us to say about ourselves, and then we refine it critically. Kind of critical common sensism is, I think that might actually go to Charles Peirce. So is this relevant today? I believe it is. And I'm going to cut way back on citing people, but I think I'll cite two bits. One is from Daniel Dennett. This is so well quoted from Consciousness Explained. There's only one kind of stuff, namely matter, the physical stuff of physics and chemistry and physiology. The mind is not extra to the brain. The mind is the brain. We can, in principle, account for every mental phenomenon with the same laws and raw materials that suffice to explain radioactivity, continental drift, photosynthesis, reproduction, nutrition, and growth. Now, I take the time to mention those because none of those involve reasons. You don't have a continent thinking and understanding propositions or states of affairs and bringing changes about photosynthesis also. Photosynthesis, I suppose, comes closest to having a functional biological description, but in any case, these do not involve reasons. Another quote, psychology, of course, I'm always wary when I see the word of course, anyway, must not, of course, be question-begging. It must not explain intelligence in terms of intelligence. For instance, by assigning responsibility for the existence of intelligence to the munificence of an intelligent creator, so that, God is out from the beginning. Actually, I heard Dennett once publicly say, if you want to be free, you have to kill God. So theism is definitely not going to be on the table for this naturalist, and or positing primitive homunculi. Dennett was in for this for a while. These are little people living, behind the brain in a Cartesian theater, and for him, as for many philosophers today, just attaching the word Cartesian to anything is like the kiss of death. But I am happy, as our moderator pointed out, as Carl pointed out, I call myself an integrative dualist in the sense that I try to understand the mind-body as integrally related. But I am, truth be told, as long as we're among friends and enemies, I am a card-carrying substance dualist. Okay, I surrendered. There's not enough time to cover that one up. I can quote Georges Ray. I can quote all these people, especially Alex Rosenberg. I'm not going to quote him, it's too long. But he basically adopts, he's a self-described atheistic naturalist or secular naturalist, a very explicit error theory. He thinks that the whole story we tell of each other, that we did this for that reason, that's why we made a peace treaty, so all of that is bullocks. All of that is rubbish. None of this is true. So now I claim over against, this is not a decisive objection against these philosophers, but it is a prima facie objection, and I would say secundum facie objection against these views, just as I believe that arguments that are well known to each of you, like Nagel's, what is it like to be a bat, came up at the same time as T.L.S. Sprigg on why is subjectivity important. All of these appeals to self-awareness, I think, overturn in the quasi-behaviorist atmosphere of Oxford and Cambridge in the 50s and 60s. That is, when Ryle and others launched their attack on introspection, I think it was a really misplaced. I actually agree with Peter Unger when he said, the concept of mind by Gilbert Ryle contains at least 3 mistakes per page. So in any case, this appeal to phenomenology, I know some people might be rolling their heads. I think I have the authority of John Paul II on my side, but I also think it is an objection that just, it's not easily dismissed. It's not easily, everybody tried to get rid of it with functionalism. If you look at the bandwidth of the literature, if you look at Robert Kuhn's book, The Waning of Materialism, you'll just see, or Howard Robinson, who spent some time in Poland, the resilience of things like the knowledge argument and these kinds of things as establishing an objection to these wholesale dismissals of the first person point of view, subjectivity, and the like. A tricky case. Oh, I'm looking at the time. I think I'm going to mention this, and then I'll go to Anscombe, Oppie, and Peter. Papineau is, I find, very difficult to interpret on this level of in terms of the argument for reason. He, on the one hand, accepts the causal closure of the physical, and he wants explanations that have, in an ideal physics, and Peter did a great job today talking about how many people are unhappy with physics today, but he, I think, perhaps like Peter, believes that at the end of the day, physics will not appeal to any psychological properties. So in terms of the argument from reason, ultimately, there's not going to be an argument for why is Socrates in jail. Or let's just give a quick example. You ask me, what's the smallest perfect number? And I think, perfect number is equal to the sum of its divisors, not including itself, but including 1. And 6 happens to be equal to 3 plus 2 plus 1. I'm giving a slightly complex thought to try to make it, I could have just said the law of identity, A is A. But why do I say 6 was the smallest perfect number? It's because I understand mathematical relations and entailment and say the word 6. And as Socrates said, wow, if you leave reasons out of it and you just try to explain why we're conversing now in terms of just voices and physical movements, you're not going to get to the real reason why I'm in prison and I'm probably going to be killed tonight. Yeah, so I think this still stands. This is maybe, if you think about, I'm now thinking of Hamlet suddenly. Those of us in my school of thought, the Cambridge Platonists and this whole stream, we think that to dispense with this is to have Hamlet without the prince. Now, to our opponents, also appealing to Hamlet, we're like Banquo, the ghost of Banquo in Macbeth, the unwanted dinner guest. Oh, you're still here. This is very uncomfortable. So I'm standing in this long strand. We've been very unpopular, but very resilient. Actually, Frank Jackson's work was appealed to, I didn't finish with Papineau. Oh my God, forgive me. Thank you, Lord. Okay, going back to Papineau and then streaming ahead to Anscombe. Papineau, he's got complete physics and then only physical explanations. But then he said, I'm very happy with alternative explanations. One of his cases is, I grab a beer because I'm thirsty. Now, I have an interpretation of what Papineau's doing here, but just pausing for a second on the notion of alternative explanations. There can be lots of alternative explanations. For example, again, to draw on Peter, he said you came across a world, discover somebody who looked like Einstein, but was actually a zombie. That would be an alternative interpretation. You know, this thing is created by AI. It's not the person who used to do physics in the States, in Germany, and Princeton. In any case, the notion of an alternative explanation is a peculiar one. But what I think might be going on, one of two things. One is he's going to it's going to be a straightforward identity theory. And so I'm thirsty, so I'm going for a beer. And that's identical with these, again, I'll just use C fibers firing. The problem with that kind of straightforward identity is that it fails, I'm going to say fails, and I will say the knowledge argument, which is the indiscernibility of identicals. You know, if A is B, anything that's true of A is true of B. Now, people get up in arms here and they say, well, look, I could know all about water, but not knowing it's H2O. I could know about the masked man robbed the bank and not know it's my father. But it turns out water actually is H2O. Turns out the masked man really is my father. But these kinds of things don't hold, it seems to me, in the mental-physical relationship. That is, you look at H2O and you find out it composes water. You follow the bank robber home and the mask comes off and you see it's the father. But that kind of unmasking or composition does not occur in the case of the mental and the physical. I'll just move on. Elizabeth Anscombe is well known for her critique of C.S. Lewis's argument from reason. And because actually two people in this conference addressed Lewis's argument from reason, I'll just make two minor observations. Three, actually. One is that I'm not appealing to Lewis, by the way, in my Platonic version of the argument from reason, for three reasons. One is he actually does use the word supernatural. Now, Peter and I had an exchange about that, but I prefer not to think of, I prefer not to use the word supernatural because of its association with wizards and goblins and so on. But also, he winds up supernaturalizing almost all experience. For him, even making a choice, he calls it supernatural. And that, I think, really set Anselm off, who was an Aristotelian at the time, for whom reasoning is natural. And I also want to see reasoning as natural. I also want to see God as natural, by the way. God, on my philosophical theology, God has a nature and so on. But so I'm avoiding the word supernatural. Also, Lewis used the term, give me 7 more minutes, please. Okay. He also used the word irrational forces, can't explain rational forces. Fine. And he changed it to non-rational forces. So he also described the influence of reason on the world is setting up pockmarks, which pockmarks are damaging things. And I think also that's not the most colorful, for one of the best writers in English in the late 20th century, that's not the best, these aren't the best terms. So setting aside all that, what is Anscombe's chief worry? Well, it's because she believes Lewis's version of the argument from reason conflates reason with causes. And she thinks that the cause of, well, my saying sex could be anything. But whether that's reasonable or not, that's another matter. I'm going to quote her. It appears that if a man has reasons, and they are good reasons, and they are genuinely his reasons for thinking something, then his thought is rational, whatever causal statement may be made about him. Now, I believe that is directly against ordinary experience or phenomenology of the first person active reasoning. When it is crucial, and it distinguishes myself from an automaton or my calculator, when I come up with 6 based on understanding, using reasons which are which warrant, justify, entitle me, give me a right to be certain, that, to use A.J. Ayer's interesting phrase, that the answer is, when you ask about the perfect number, 6. So I think that I would also go on, I'm just going to gesture in this direction. Anscombe goes on, under the influence of Wittgenstein, to claim that you can explain somebody poisoning a water table without any recourse to internal mental events at all. I believe that also faces a phenomenological challenge. Now, maybe this can be overcome, but I'm saying it does show that Platonic reasoning, 4th century BCE, still has a role to play, still has a voice here. She also goes so far as to question the substantial existence of the self. In her later work, she actually refers to the I as a grammatical illusion. Okay, Graham Oppie, even briefer, he objects to the argument from reason because he thinks physical objects can have propositional content. And he adopts the causal closure of the physical world and the like. On this front, I would say two replies. One is that if he adopts the causal closure of the physical world, then it's the physical world and its physical aspects that have to do the explaining. These leave out the mental aspects, in my view. If he goes identity theory, then I think he faces the knowledge argument. Now, my response to Peter actually has an extensive analysis of C.S. Lewis's argument from reason. It would take too long to go through. It's been replied to by several people, Brandon Rickenbach, Todd Moran, Stuart Gatz, and so on. But it's the one argument I'm going to go, objection he has, and I'll quote him on this, a principle of rationality, and he here is identifying a principle of rationality as why we might adopt modus ponens, or perhaps is a proposition or perhaps an imperative. In any case, an abstract object of some sort. And if there's one thing abstract objects do not do, it is this. They don't exert influence on things. Now, I actually, well, I have a complicated view here, but what I would say is it's different from claiming the abstract object actually causes Athena to emerge from the head of Zeus, or water to boil, or anything like that. But I submit to you that abstract objects play an indispensable role in the course of reasoning. For me to answer 6 requires to have a sufficient explanation, not just explaining what's necessary for my blood sugar to be low, for there to be oxygen, for me to know English, and so on. But an absolutely indispensable role in explaining that actually will be grasping mathematical entailment relationships. So I've sought in my ham-handed way after this amazing acoustic beginning, which I will remember for the rest of my life. We have a half-hour multiple objections for. I said there's much to be unhappy about, probably with most of you here, but I presented a kind of simplistic argument from reason going back 2,350 years, inspired by Plato. I've said, is it still relevant? Cited several people. I could have gone on and on, Paul and Patricia Churchland, et cetera, et cetera. I quoted Papina. Yes, it's still relevant. It still constitutes an important matter for philosophers. Then I looked at three prominent philosophers who objected more recently to the argument from reason, and I offered some hand-wavy ways of replying. Thank you for coming.
I would like to thank Professor Taliaferro for his speech, I think his talk, and his responses as well. It's been most stimulating, most interesting. So thank you very much for that.